Shortly after midnight on July 17th, 1918, in the basement of a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg, a family stood together for the last time. The room was roughly 11 feet by 13 feet, bare walls, a single window behind an iron grating. Two chairs had been carried in, one for the mother, whose legs were failing, and one for the 13-year-old boy who could not stand on his own. The father had carried him down the stairs. Four young women stood behind their parents, close together, dressed carefully, as if proximity were the last thing they could control. They had been told they were being moved for their safety. They had no reason to disbelieve it. They had been obeying instructions from armed men for 16 months. When the commandant entered with 11 soldiers and read from a piece of paper, the father turned toward his family and began to speak. He did not finish. The world knew them as the Romanov sisters. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, the jeweled, endlessly photographed daughters of the last Russian emperor, born into 3 centuries of dynastic power and raised inside palaces so vast they seemed like countries of their own. The public saw a composure, beauty, ceremony, and permanence. The private reality was a family sealed inside its own fear, organized around a secret illness, and watching the empire that defined them disintegrate year by year. This is the story of 4 sisters, the eldest 22, the youngest 17, who never lived outside the world their parents built around them and never got the chance to build one of their own. From the nurseries of the Alexander Palace to the basement of the Ipatiev house, across revolution, war, captivity, and a silence that lasted 70 years, this is what was actually happening behind the name. But to understand how 4 sisters ended up standing in that basement, arranged like a portrait no one would ever see, you have to go back, not to the revolution, not even to the war. You have to go back to the world that made them, the world that gave them everything a person could hold in their hands and almost nothing a person actually needs. This is the story of the Romanov sisters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, born into the most powerful dynasty in Russia, raised inside ceremony and devotion and imperial scale, and destroyed before any of them reached the age of 23. The public would remember them as glittering daughters of empire, symbols of a vanished world, faces in sepia photographs that seemed to belong to a fairy tale someone had already finished telling. But the private reality was different. Behind the jewels and the palace corridors and the official portraits, these were 4 distinct young women. Intelligent, funny, anxious, loving, and trapped inside a name so enormous it left no room for the people carrying it. Their story is not in the end about the fall of a monarchy. It is about what happens to children when the thing they were born into begins to collapse and no one can get them out. The name itself carried 3 centuries of weight. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia since 1613, when Michael Romanov was chosen by a national assembly to end a period of chaos and disputed succession. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Romanovs presided over the largest contiguous empire on earth, stretching from Poland to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the borders of Persia and China. The family's position was not merely political. The Tsar was anointed by the Orthodox Church, understood by millions of subjects as God's chosen ruler, and surrounded by a ceremonial apparatus so vast and so deeply embedded in Russian life that it seemed to those inside it as permanent as geography. That was the inheritance the 4 sisters were born into, not just wealth, not just palaces, a system of belief that told them the world they occupied was ordained and would endure. That belief would prove to be the most dangerous thing they ever inherited. Their father was Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, born in 1868, crowned emperor and autocrat of all the Russias in 1894 at the age of 26, after the sudden death of his father, Alexander III. The coronation came sooner than anyone expected, and Nicholas himself reportedly told a cousin in the days after his father's death that he was not prepared. He did not know what would happen. He did not know what was going to become of Russia. He was in that moment not an emperor, but a young man standing at the edge of a role he had been raised to hold in theory and dreaded in practice. By most accounts, Nicholas was a gentle, courteous, physically slight man who loved his family, his dogs, his afternoon walks, and the comforting routines of domestic life. He enjoyed photography. He kept a meticulous diary. He was attentive to his children in ways that surprised visitors who expected imperial distance. He was also, by nearly every serious historical assessment, catastrophically unsuited to the political demands of his position. He lacked strategic instinct. He distrusted advisors who challenged him and gravitated toward those who confirmed what he already believed. He held to the autocratic principle, the idea that the Tsar's authority was absolute and divinely sanctioned, with a sincerity that prevented him from adapting to a country that was modernizing, urbanizing, and straining at every seam beneath him. He was not cruel. He was not stupid. He was a man of narrow vision, placed at the center of an empire that required breadth, and the distance between what he was and what the situation demanded would cost his family everything. Their mother was Alexandra Feodorovna, born Princess Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt in 1872, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria through her mother, Princess Alice. She arrived in Russia as a shy, intensely private young woman who converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy with the fervor of someone who did not merely adopt a new faith but absorbed it entirely. Her marriage to Nicholas was a genuine love match. Their letters and diaries, which survived the revolution and were published over the following decades, confirm a bond of deep mutual devotion, physical affection, and emotional dependence that lasted until the final night of their lives. But Alexandra never found her footing inside the Russian court. She was stiff in public, uncomfortable with the theatrical sociability the court life demanded, suspicious of the aristocracy she was supposed to charm, and increasingly consumed by a private religious intensity that isolated her from the people who might have helped her family navigate the pressures closing in around them. The St. Petersburg elite found her cold. Foreign diplomats found her difficult. Servants found her demanding. She was, in the language of the court, impossible. In the language of a more generous and perhaps more accurate assessment, she was a woman of enormous emotional depth who had almost no outlet for it except her husband, her children, and her God. That narrowing and that retreat from the public world into the private one would have consequences none of them could foresee. The daughters arrived in quick succession, and each birth carried a public sting that the private joy could not erase. Olga Nikolaevna was born on November 15th, 1895. Tatiana Nikolaevna arrived on June 10th, 1897. Maria Nikolaevna on June 26th, 1899. Anastasia Nikolaevna on June 18th, 1901. 4 healthy, beautiful daughters, and 4 reminders that the dynasty still lacked a male heir. In the world of European monarchy, and especially under the rigid Romanov succession laws that barred women from the throne, this was not a private disappointment. It was a public crisis conducted in slow motion. With each daughter, the whispers grew louder. The Tsar's wife could not produce a son. The dynasty's future was unsecured. The superstitious talk that surrounded Alexandra, already a foreigner, already a convert, already a figure of court suspicion, intensified with each pink-blanketed announcement. The gossip said she was cursed. The gossip said the marriage was punished. The gossip said things that had nothing to do with 4 small girls and everything to do with the anxieties of a court that sensed, even then, that something fundamental was wrong. All of it settled on the sisters. Before they were old enough to understand it, they entered life already carrying the weight of what they were not. And yet the private world those 4 girls inhabited was, for a time, something close to genuinely happy. Nicholas and Alexandra raised their daughter with a mixture of imperial formality and surprising domestic simplicity that visitors often found startling. The girls slept on hard camp beds with thin mattresses. They took cold baths every morning, a practice Alexandra believed was good for discipline and constitution. They wore hand-me-down dresses. Olga's clothes passed to Tatiana, Tatiana's to Maria, Maria's to Anastasia, and their personal allowances were modest by the standards of their position. They were expected to tidy their own rooms, at least in theory, and to treat servants with courtesy and respect. The palaces themselves were enormous. The Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, where the family spent most of its time, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, the Lividia Palace on the coast of Crimea. But the family's actual living quarters were kept deliberately intimate. The girls shared bedrooms. Alexandra wanted her daughters close, contained, protected from the court's intrigues and the public's gaze. The result was a childhood that was simultaneously vast and claustrophobic, limitless rooms and grounds and servants and ceremony, but an emotional world that extended no further than the family itself. Everything beyond that circle was treated, by Alexandra especially, as a threat. Within that world, the four sisters developed personalities so distinct that the people around them could describe each one in a sentence. And those descriptions remained consistent across memoirs, letters, and later interviews with surviving members of the household. Olga, the eldest, was the intellectual, thoughtful, moody, musical, prone to sharp opinions and occasional bouts of deep melancholy that worried her mother. She read widely in Russian and English. She played piano with real feeling and a seriousness that went beyond the expected accomplishment of a grand duchess. She was the sister most likely to question the constraints of their life, to push back against protocol, to ask why things had to be done the way they had always been done. By her teenage years, she had begun to express a longing for something simpler and more honest than the imperial existence, a desire for love on her own terms, for a life that was not arranged, that would never be fulfilled. Tatiana's second born was the organizer, in tall, elegant, fine-boned, self-possessed, with a natural authority that emerged early and never wavered. She managed her youngest sisters with a firm hand. She attended to her mother during Alexandra's frequent illnesses and emotional collapses. She carried herself with a composure that made her seem older than her years, and the family gave her the nickname the Governess, not as an insult, but as a recognition of something real. If Olga wanted escape, Tatiana wanted order. She was the sister who held things together, and that role would follow her to the end. Maria, the third, was the heart, warm, open, physically the strongest of the four, emotionally generous to a degree that sometimes left her exposed. She was the sister most drawn to the world outside the family circle, the one who talked to servants and soldiers and gardeners as if rank did not exist. She dreamed openly of marriage, of children, of a large, noisy, affectionate household. She wanted to be a mother. She said so often, without embarrassment, in a family where such simplicity of desire was almost radical. Anastasia, the youngest, was the voltage. Funny, loud, quick, mischievous, physically fearless, and gifted with a sense of timing that made her comedy feel natural rather than practiced. She did impressions of diplomats and tutors. She tripped her sisters. She climbed trees when she was told not to, and hid when she was supposed to be at lessons. She used humor the way some people use armor, instinctively, protectively, and with the understanding that if she could make the people around her laugh, the weight pressing down on the household might lift even for a moment. Later, myth would flatten Anastasia into the lost princess, the possible survivor, the ghost who might have walked away from a massacre. But in life, she was simply the funniest person in the family, and that mattered more than any legend ever could. Alexandra grouped them instinctively. Olga and Tatiana were the big pair, Maria and Anastasia, the little pair. The sisters themselves went further. They invented a collective signature, OTMA, formed from the first letters of their names, and used it on letters, on gifts, and in telegrams as a private shorthand for their unity. They gave presents from OTMA. They signed cards from OTMA. The detail matters because it reveals the emotional architecture of their lives more clearly than any outside description could. They were not four separate princes living parallel existences inside the same palace. They were a unit, a closed system of mutual protection, private language, shared anxieties, and absolute loyalty. The strength of that bond is part of what makes their story so difficult to sit with, because it means that what happened to them at the end happened to all of them together, in the same room, at the same moment, with full knowledge of what was happening to the others. The event that reshaped every sister's life arrived on August 12th, 1904, with the birth of their brother, Alexei Nikolaevich, a son, a male heir. The cannons fired across St. Petersburg, church bells rang. The dynasty's crisis of succession was, on paper, resolved. But within weeks, the family discovered what Alexandra had likely feared from the moment she understood her own genetic inheritance. Alexei had hemophilia, a bleeding disorder passed through the maternal line from Queen Victoria, which had already afflicted several of Alexandra's nephews and cousins. A bump, a fall, a bruise that would mean nothing for another child could trigger internal hemorrhaging that lasted for days, swelled joints to grotesque proportions, and brought the boy to the edge of death with terrifying regularity. There was no cure. There was no reliable treatment. There was only waiting, watching, praying, and a terror so constant that it became the organizing principle of the entire household. For the four sisters, Alexei's illness changed everything. They became, in effect, secondary caretakers, monitoring his play, managing his moods when pain made him irritable or despairing, absorbing the household's perpetual anxiety as if it were weather. They watched their mother retreat further into religious devotion and nervous illness, spending days in bed, consumed by guilt over the genetic inheritance she had passed to her son. They watched their father carry a grief he could not discuss publicly because the heir's condition was a state secret. The hemophilia was never officially acknowledged during the family's lifetime. The court knew, the doctors knew, certain foreign relatives knew, but the Russian public did not, and that secrecy created a sealed chamber of worry inside an already sealed world. The sisters lived in that chamber every day. It taught them, before anything else, that everything their family appeared to possess, the palaces, the jewels, the titles, the divine right of succession, the 300 years of accumulated authority, could not purchase the one thing they actually needed: safety. That lesson was the truest thing about their childhood, and it was the one thing the public would never see in the photographs. And for a handful of years, the world outside the chamber still appeared to hold. The Romanov centenary in 1913 was the dynasty's last great public performance, a pageant of processions, ceremonies, church services, and carefully choreographed appearances designed to project 300 years of unbroken continuity into a future that no one in the family could actually see. The four sisters, now aged 17, 15, 13, and 11, appeared in white dresses and imperial jewels, photographed endlessly, admired as the embodiment of dynastic promise and aristocratic grace. Foreign newspapers speculated about their future marriages, which European prince would win, which Romanov daughter, and what alliances would follow. Society observers praised their composure, their beauty, their bearing. In photographs from that year, they looked like what they were supposed to be: the serene, luminous daughters of an eternal empire. Those photographs are still in circulation. They are beautiful, and they are lies in the way that all official images are lies, not because the girls were unhappy, but because the photographs show permanence, and permanence was the one thing the family did not have. Behind the photographs, the family was already under siege. Grigori Rasputin, a Siberian wanderer, self-proclaimed holy man, and figure of almost mythological controversy, had entered the Romanovs' inner circle the years earlier, drawn by Alexandra's desperation to find anyone who could help her son. By most modern accounts, Rasputin did appear to calm Alexei during bleeding crises. The mechanism remains debated. Some historians suggest hypnosis or simple force of personality. Others that Rasputin may have instructed doctors to stop administering aspirin, which was commonly prescribed at the time and would have worsened the hemorrhaging. Whatever the explanation, Alexandra became dependent on him with an intensity that went beyond gratitude and into something closer to spiritual submission. She believed he was sent by God. She trusted his counsel on matters far beyond Alexei's health. And that dependency became a political catastrophe of the first order. Rumors, many exaggerated, some fabricated by political enemies, a few grounded in the reality of Rasputin's behavior, spread through St. Petersburg society and then across European capitals. Rasputin was said to be Alexandra's lover, her spiritual master, her political puppet master. Satirical cartoons circulated depicting the empress in his arms. The damage to the dynasty's credibility was enormous, irreversible, and largely self-inflicted, because Alexandra's refusal to distance herself from Rasputin gave her enemies all the ammunition they needed. The four sisters lived inside that damage every day, watching their mother cling to a figure the rest of the world had decided was either a charlatan or a monster, and understanding, each in her own way, that the family's public standing was crumbling around them while their mother insisted nothing was wrong. Then the war came, and the sealed world cracked open. When Russia entered the First World War in August of 1914, The conflict was greeted with an initial surge of patriotic enthusiasm that briefly seemed to unify the country behind the Tsar. That unity did not last. The war was a catastrophe from nearly the beginning. Enormous casualties, chronic supply failures, command blunders that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But inside the family, the war's first effect was something almost like liberation. Olga and Tatiana, now 19 and 17, trained as Red Cross nurses under the supervision of Princess Vera Gedroitz, one of Russia's first female surgeons, and worked in a military hospital at Tsarskoye Selo. They dressed wounds. They assisted in surgeries. They held the hands of soldiers who were dying. They changed dressing soaked with blood and pus and cleaned wounds that smelled of gangrene. For girls who had been raised inside the sealed perfection of palace life, the hospital was a revelation, not a pleasant one, but a real one. For the first time, they were doing something that mattered outside the family circle. Maria and Anastasia, too young for full nursing duties, visited wounded soldiers in the wards, read to them, played cards and checkers, wrote letters for men whose hands were too damaged to hold a pen. The younger sisters encountered, for the first time in their lives, ordinary people in ordinary suffering. Men their own age or only slightly older who had been sent to war by the same state that dressed their sisters in diamonds. The war gave the Romanov daughters something their upbringing had systematically denied them: contact with the world beyond the family. Olga and Tatiana, by several accounts, were deeply moved and permanently changed by what they saw in the wards: the shattered bodies, the amputations, the young men blinded by gas or missing limbs. Tatiana characteristically channeled her response into action, organizing charitable committees and working with a focus that impressed the hospital staff. Olga absorbed the suffering more personally, and the melancholy that had always been part of her temperament deepened into something closer to grief. For a brief, strange period, all four sisters had purpose outside the palace walls. That purpose would be taken from them along with everything else. But the same war that opened the sisters' world was destroying the state that made them princesses. By 1915, Nicholas had left Tsarskoye Selo to take personal command of the Russian army at Stavka, the military headquarters, a decision that tied every subsequent battlefield failure directly to his name and left Alexandra and Rasputin exercising expanded domestic influence at precisely the moment when public contempt for both had reached a fever pitch. Food shortages worsened. The casualty figures were staggering. By some estimates, Russia suffered over 5 million military casualties by 1917, a population exhausted, hungry, and increasingly certain that the ruling family was either incompetent or treasonous, began to lose whatever faith remained in the system the Romanovs represented. Rasputin was murdered in December of 1916 by a group of aristocrats led by Prince Felix Yusupov, who believed that removing the mystic might save the monarchy. The killing was brutal, prolonged, and almost farcical in its execution, and it did nothing to slow the collapse. By February of 1917, strikes and protests in Petrograd had overwhelmed the city. Soldiers sent to suppress the demonstration joined them instead. On March 15th, 1917, Nicholas II, on a train stopped at the city of Pskov, signed the Instrument of Abdication. 304 years of Romanov rule ended with a document and a signature. Nicholas reportedly recorded the weather in his diary that evening. That abdication is the first clean fracture in the Romanov sisters' lives. In a single day, the four young women ceased to be Grand Duchesses of a reigning dynasty and became the daughters of a former emperor under house arrest. They lost not just privilege, but the entire framework of the future they had been raised to expect: the marriages, the court positions, the ceremonial roles, the possibility of lives shaped, however constrained, by their own choices within the structure of their rank. All of it gone. Not gradually, not through a slow erosion they could track and adapt to, but at once, like a floor giving way. The family was confined at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, guarded by soldiers who had recently been their own household troops. Then, in August of 1917, they were transferred to Tobolsk, a remote Siberian town where the provisional government believed they would be safe from both monarchist rescue attempts and revolutionary violence. Tobolsk was cold, isolated, and dull, but it still allowed the illusion of a possible future. The family retained a sizable household, dozens of servants and attendants who had chosen to follow them into captivity. They kept many of their possessions, their books, their icons, their personal effects. They could still imagine outcomes that did not end in abasement. Exile in England, where King George V was Nicholas's cousin. Retirement in Crimea, where the Lividia Palace still stood. Some version of a life, even a diminished one. The sisters adapted as they always had, each according to her nature. Olga retreated inward, reading and praying and growing quieter by the week. Tatiana organized what could be organized, schedules, lessons, the distribution of tasks among a household that was shrinking as servants were dismissed or chose to leave. Maria befriended the guards, talking to them across the fence in the yard with the easy warmth that had always been her defining quality. Anastasia made everyone laugh, staging plays and pulling pranks and refusing through sheer force of personality to let the household sink entirely into despair. They sawed wood in the yard for exercise. They built an ice slide in the winter and rode it like children, because in many ways they still were. And through all of it, they held to the single emotional principle that had governed their lives since the nursery: stay together. Whatever happened, stay together. That principle held through the winter and into the spring of 1918. And then the Bolsheviks shattered it. In April, orders came to transfer Nicholas and Alexandra to Yekaterinburg, a harder, more radical city in the Ural Mountains controlled by the Ural Soviet, whose leaders were more hostile to the family than the relatively moderate authorities in Tobolsk had been. But Alexei was gravely ill. Another hemorrhaging episode had left him bedridden, unable to stand, his legs swollen and agonizing, and the entire family could not travel together. A choice had to be made. Someone had to go with Nicholas and Alexandra. Someone had to stay behind with Alexei. Maria went with her parents. The decision may have been made by the Bolsheviks, or it may have been made within the family, and the accounts vary, but the result was the same. On April 26, 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria departed Tobolsk under armed escort, heading east toward Yekaterinburg. Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia stayed behind with their brother, waiting for him to recover enough to make the journey. It was the first time in their lives the sisters had been physically divided. The family whose single unbreakable rule was unity, whose collective signature was OTMA, whose identity was built on the principle that they moved through the world together, had been broken apart by a revolution that understood, perhaps better than the Romanovs themselves, that separation was its own kind of violence. Maria traveled east with her parents toward a house the Bolsheviks had already requisitioned and already named. They called it the House of Special Purpose. And in Tobolsk, 3 sisters sat beside their brother's sickbed and waited for the word that they could follow. The reunion took 3 weeks. In late May of 1918, Alexei had recovered enough to travel, and the remaining children, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and their brother, were transported by train and then by cart to Yekaterinburg. The journey was rough, supervised by Bolshevik commissars who treated the children with open indifference. When they arrived, they found their parents and Maria already confined inside a 2-story merchant's house on Voznesensky Prospect that had been requisitioned from a retired military engineer named Nikolai Ipatiev. A tall wooden fence had been erected around the property, high enough to block any view from the street. The windows on the upper floor had been whitewashed so the family could not see out and no one could see in. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter and occupied the ground floor. The family was given 5 rooms on the upper story. The Bolsheviks had stripped the house of most furnishings and comforts, and what remained felt provisional, temporary, and watched. The sisters had left the Alexander Palace with trunks of belongings. By the time they reached the Ipatiev house, those belongings had been searched, confiscated, and reduced to what the guards considered acceptable. The physical diminishment was systematic. Each transfer had taken something away: a palace, a town, a set of freedoms, a set of possessions. And the Ipatiev house was the last stop in that long subtraction. The contrast with Tobolsk was immediate and deliberate. In Tobolsk, the family had retained servants, personal items, a degree of daily movement, and the persistent illusion that the situation might resolve into something survivable. They had staged small theatrical performances for each other. They had maintained lessons. They had been able to imagine a future, even if they could not see its shape. In Yekaterinburg, the illusion was gone. The guards were coarser and more openly hostile, the restrictions tighter, the atmosphere heavier with purpose. The family was allowed one short walk per day in a small garden, and even that privilege was supervised with pointed attention. Their belongings were searched repeatedly. Their correspondence was monitored and censored. The guards scratched obscene drawings on the walls of the bathroom, crude depictions of Alexandra and Rasputin that the family was forced to see every day. It was a particular kind of cruelty, designed not to injure, but to humiliate, and it worked. Alexandra, by all accounts, withdrew further into silence and prayer. Nicholas maintained his courteous composure, but had lost the ability to shield his children from what was happening around them. The commandant during those first weeks was Alexander Avdeyev, a Bolshevik loyalist who drank heavily and whose authority over the guards was inconsistent. In early July, Avdeyev was replaced by Yakov Yurovsky, and the change was felt immediately. Yurovsky was a different kind of man. Methodical, sober, cold, and task-oriented. He tightened discipline among the guards. He inventoried the family's remaining valuables with meticulous care. He reorganized the guard shifts and placed trusted men at key positions. He studied the layout of the house with the attention of someone preparing for something specific. The family noticed. Tatiana, the most observant of the sisters in matters of household order, would have registered the shift in routine. Even Nicholas, who had maintained a deliberate calm throughout captivity, noted the change in atmosphere in his diary entries. Yurovsky did not explain himself. He simply made the house more efficient, which in context meant he made it more ready. For the four sisters, the weeks inside the Ipatyev house were the final compression of a world that had been shrinking for over a year. Olga, now 22, had grown quieter and more withdrawn than at any point in her life. By several accounts, she spent much of her time reading, praying, and sitting with her mother, who was increasingly frail and consumed by religious devotion. Olga had always been the sister most attuned to the emotional weather around her, the one who felt things before she could name them. And in Yekaterinburg, that weather was unmistakable. She understood, in a way that the younger sisters may not have fully grasped, that the options had narrowed to almost nothing. There would be no exile in England. There would be no retirement in Crimea. The future had become a closed door, and Olga seems to have known it. Tatiana, 21, continued to do what she had always done: manage, organize, maintain order inside disorder. She attended to Alexei, helped with meals, kept the household's diminished routines functioning, and carried herself with the composure that had earned her childhood nickname. If Tatiana was afraid, the people around her rarely saw it. She kept the family's daily life moving as if movement itself were a form of resistance. Maria, 19, had been in the house longest, having arrived with her parents weeks before the others, and she had done what Maria always did. She talked to the guards. She befriended them. She asked about their lives, their families, their names. One guard in particular, a young man named Ivan Skorokodov, appears to have developed an attachment to her, and the interaction was noticed and reported. Maria was reprimanded, and Skorokodov was removed from duty. The incident is a small one, but it reveals something essential about who Maria was, even in captivity. She reached outward. She trusted. She believed that individual kindness could still function inside a system that had already decided her fate. Anastasia, 17, kept doing what she had always done best. She joked. She teased. She played with the family's spaniel, Joy, and tried to lift the mood in rooms where the mood had become almost impossible to lift. She performed impressions of the people around her. She found absurdity where others saw only dread. Her humor in those final weeks was not performance. It was the only tool she had, and she used it the way she always had, to keep the people she loved from sinking entirely. Outside the whitewashed windows, the military situation was deteriorating for the Bolsheviks in ways that would determine everything. The White Army, a loose coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces supported by the Czech Legion, was advancing toward Yekaterinburg from the east, and their progress was accelerating. By early July of 1918, the city was under real threat of falling, possibly within weeks. For the Ural Soviet and for Moscow, the Romanov family had become something worse than prisoners. They had become a liability. A living czar, even an abdicated one, was a symbol the white forces could rally around. Living children, potential heirs, potential claimants, potential figureheads for a monarchist restoration made the danger worse. The logic of the revolution, once it reached this point, left very little room for mercy. The family had to be removed from the board entirely, not exiled, not imprisoned elsewhere, removed. The decision was made. The precise chain of authorization has been debated by historians for decades. Whether the order came directly from Lenin and Yakov Sverdlov in Moscow, or whether the Ural Soviet acted with broad implicit permission and filled in the details themselves. What is not in dispute is this. By mid-July, Yurovsky had received instructions to execute the entire family, and he had begun making preparations with the calm precision that characterized everything he did. He arranged for a truck to arrive after midnight to transport the bodies. He selected a half-basement room in the Ipatiev house, small enclosed with a single window covered by heavy iron grating. He assembled a squad of executioners, 11 men in total, a mix of Bolshevik secret police officers and local soldiers, and he assigned each man a specific target. Revolvers were distributed. The planning was detailed, deliberate, and procedural. This was not a mob action. This was not an act of passion or a riot that spiraled. It was an organized killing carried out by men who had been told exactly what they were about to do and who had accepted the assignment. On the evening of July 16, 1918, a Tuesday, the Romanov family went to bed as they had every other night in the Ipatiev house. There was nothing in the routine of the day to distinguish it from any that preceded it. They had their short walk in the garden, they had their evening meal, they said their prayers together, as they always did. Alexei, still unable to walk properly from his most recent hemorrhaging episode, was carried to his bed. The daughters helped their mother settle into her room. The 4 loyal attendants who had followed the family into captivity, Dr. Eugene Botkin, the family physician, Anna Demidova, the maid, Ivan Karatonov, the cook, and Alexei Trupp, the footman, retired to their own quarters. The household settled into the quiet of another confined night in a confined house in a city they had not chosen and could not leave. Outside, the truck was already on its way. Shortly after midnight, now technically July 17th, Yurovsky woke Dr. Botkin and instructed him to wake the family. They were told to dress and come downstairs. The explanation given was that there was unrest in the city and that they needed to be moved to the basement for their own safety, as they would soon be transferred elsewhere. There is something about that lie worth sitting with for a moment. Even at the end, the mechanism of their destruction required the pretense of protection. The family was being led to their execution under the fiction that someone was still looking after them. And the family believed it, or at least did not resist it, because they had spent 16 months in captivity learning to comply with every instruction that came from the men who held them. They took roughly 40 minutes to dress. Alexandra insisted that the family present themselves properly. Nicholas carried Alexei down the stairs, 23 steps from the upper floor to the basement level. Alexandra asked for a chair because her legs were painful. A second chair was brought for Alexei. The family and their 4 attendants were led into the small room Yurovsky had selected, roughly 11 feet by 13 feet. Bare walls, a stripped wooden floor, damp air, no furniture except the 2 chairs. The family arranged themselves with the unconscious formality of people who had spent their entire lives being positioned for display. Nicholas stood in front, near the center. Alexandra sat in one chair. Alexei sat in the other. The 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and stood behind their parents, close together. Dr. Botkin stood near Nicholas. Demidova, Karitonov, and Troop stood along the far wall. They stood the way they had stood for 100 official portraits, composed, quiet, together, waiting to be told what came next. Yurovsky entered the room with the execution squad, 11 armed men filing into a space that was already too small for the 12 people inside it. The air was thick. Yurovsky carried a piece of paper. He read a statement informing Nicholas that the Ural Regional Soviet of Workers' Deputies had ordered the family to be executed. Nicholas turned toward his family. By Yurovsky's later account, the Tsar managed only the beginning of a response. What? What? Before Yurovsky raised his revolver and fired into his chest. The first volley killed Nicholas almost immediately. Alexandra was struck before she could finish crossing herself. Dr. Botkin fell. Karitonov and Trupp were hit. The room filled with smoke and noise so dense that the executioners could barely see their own hands. The walls, made of plaster over stone, sent bullets ricocheting at unpredictable angles. At least one executioner was struck by a deflected round. And then the killing went wrong in a way no one in that room had anticipated. Bullets struck the daughters and did not kill them. The four sisters were wearing corsets and undergarments into which they had sewn diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and strands of pearls, hidden there weeks or months earlier as a precaution against theft, a final act of preservation by a family that had been losing everything in slow degrees. The stones, packed densely against the fabric, acted as a kind of improvised armor. Rounds that should have passed through bodies were deflected or slowed. The girls fell from the impact but did not die. In the smoke and confusion and screaming, the executioners, deafened by gunfire in an enclosed space, lost control of the scene. What had been planned as a swift, efficient execution became something no plan could have accounted for. Bayonets were used, rifle butts were brought down, pistols were pressed directly against bodies and fired again. The killing of the four sisters and their brother, children who had done nothing to anyone except carry a name, took, by Yurovsky's own later written account, more than 20 minutes. Olga was 22 years old. Tatiana was 21. Maria was 19. Anastasia was 17. Alexei was 13. The aftermath was managed with the same grim efficiency as the preparation. The bodies were loaded onto the waiting truck before dawn and driven into the forest outside Yekaterinburg. Yurovsky's squad attempted to destroy the remains, first with sulfuric acid poured over the faces to prevent identification, then by burning, then by burial in a shallow pit near an abandoned mineshaft along the Koptyaki road. The disposal was hurried and incomplete, complicated by rain and by the squad's own disorganization after the violence of the basement. That incompleteness would matter decades later, when the remains became the key to closing the questions the Bolsheviks had worked so hard to keep open. In the days that followed, Soviet authorities announced only that Nicholas had been executed. The fate of Alexandra and the children was left deliberately ambiguous. The government let the silence do its work. Rumors spread across Europe. Contradictory reports surfaced in newspapers and diplomatic cables. The family that had been killed together in a single room was separated in death by a campaign of official obfuscation that would last more than 70 years. That silence created the space for one of the 20th century's most persistent myths, the survival of Anastasia. Almost immediately, and then for decades afterward, claimants emerged. Women who insisted they were the youngest Romanov daughter, that they had somehow escaped the basement, that they had been smuggled out, hidden, and lost to the world. The most famous was Anna Anderson, a woman who surfaced in Berlin in the early 1920s and whose claim occupied European courts, tabloid pages, and family arguments for the better part of a century. The myth served a deep cultural need. If Anastasia survived, the story had an exception, a loophole in the Annihilation. One child got out. The pull of that fantasy was so powerful that it reshaped how the world remembered the entire family, reducing four distinct sisters to one, and reducing that one to a ghost story that had more to do with the audience's need for consolation than with anything that actually happened in the basement. Popular culture reinforced the compression. The 1956 film Anastasia, starring Ingrid Bergman and Yul Brynner, dramatized the survival fantasy with Hollywood elegance and fixed the name permanently in popular imagination as a synonym for miraculous escape. The 1971 film Nicholas and Alexandra, directed by Franklin J. Schaffner and featuring Michael Jaston and Janet Suzman, told a broader family story with more historical fidelity, but still organized its emotional weight around the doomed parents rather than the children. More recently, Netflix's The Last Tsars in 2019 revisited the dynasty's collapse through a docudrama lens that leaned heavily on Rasputin and palace intrigue. In each retelling, the adaptations captured the spectacle and the doom, but tended to flatten the sisters into a collective, beautiful, tragic, interchangeable, rather than the four sharply distinct young women they actually were. It took historians working with private letters and diaries, particularly Helen Rappaport in Four Sisters and the Romanov sisters, to push back against that flattening and insist on what should have been obvious from the start: that Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia were individuals who thought differently, loved differently, feared differently, and faced the same destruction from four separate emotional positions. None of them survived. The myth of Anastasia's escape was disproven by forensic science in stages. After the fall of the Soviet Union, a mass grave near Yekaterinburg was exhumed in 1991, and the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and three of the daughters were identified through DNA analysis, cross referenced with blood samples from living Romanov relatives and from Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, a maternal relative of Alexandra. A second, smaller grave, discovered nearby in 2007, yielded the remains of two more individuals, Alexei and one of the sisters, believed to be Maria. The identifications closed the question that had haunted the century. All seven members of the immediate family died in the basement of the Ipatiev house on the night of July 16th and 17th, 1918. No one escaped. No one was hidden. No one walked away. The remains were interred at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg in 1998, in a state funeral attended by Russian political leaders and Romanov descendants who had traveled from across Europe to stand over graves that had been denied to them for 80 years. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the family as passion bearers, saints who accepted death with Christian humility and grace. The Ipatiev house itself had been demolished in 1977 on the orders of Boris Yeltsin. Then a regional Communist Party official, acting on Moscow's instruction, precisely because it had become a site of quiet, unauthorized pilgrimage. In its place, the Church on the Blood was built and consecrated in 2003. Every year on the anniversary of the execution, thousands of pilgrims walk through the night to the site and hold a vigil that lasts until morning. The Romanov sisters had rank. They had photographs and jewels and palaces and the full weight of 300 years of dynastic ceremony arranged behind their names. They did not have privacy. They did not have freedom. They did not have futures they were allowed to choose. What they had in the end was each other. The closed circle of OTMA, the big pair and the little pair, the shared jokes and shared anxieties and the shared understanding that the world they had been born into was not something they had asked for and not something they could leave. Their story reveals what dynastic power actually does to the children inside it. It protects appearance long after it stops protecting life. It teaches composure when it should teach escape. It surrounds its inheritors with symbols of permanence and then offers no mechanism for survival when the permanence fails. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia spend the last months of their lives wanting only one thing: to remain together, to stay a family, to walk into whatever came next, side by side.